managed to get here and not get lost. Some of us got lost a little. And welcome to our session on paratransit, fleet recapitalization and professionalization. It's a handful of things to say, and it's a little bit hard to pronounce, but we're really excited to have you all here. We have an amazing panel today with a lot of experiences from all around the world. We have Fernanda Rivera from the Mexico Secretariat of Mobility. We have Tinus Boysen, I hope I'm pronouncing it well, professor in engineering and research chair in the Internet of Things in Stellenbosch University. We have Pawan Mulukutla. Yes, Executive Program Director and Integrated Transport Clean Air and Hydrogen at WRI. And we also have Lenaik Georgelan, Transport Team Leader and Urban Development at the European Commission. And he's also part of the SSATP Executive Committee member. And my name is Andrea Zangil. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Network for Popular Transportation. We are co-hosting this session with SSATP. Thanks, Simon, for all the support and the help with the organizing this panel. I'll do just some introductions on what we're going to talk about today. Today, we're going to talk about what I like to call popular transport. There's different names to call it. You will see probably different panelists today will use different terms. But essentially, what we refer to when we talk about popular transport is any type of collective shared public transport that is not offered by the governments. It's usually not regulated. It's flexible. It's provided by private operators. And it's often not even recognized by the government. So it operates in the margins of regulation. It's often called informal transport, paratransit, artisanal transport. That's the names we use in academia and formal spaces, but in the roads, it's called matatus and boraboras and colectivos and taxis piratas and ojeks. And so depending on the country you're in, maybe there's a different name to address it. But the important thing to remember and understand when we talk about popular transport, it's that it moves millions of people around the world, and it's the main source of public transportation for a lot of people around the world. So it's an essential service that we need to support, to invest in, and to improve accessibility and quality of life for people. So why are we talking about this topic today? Usually when we talk about popular transport, the simple thing to think about is, well, just regulate it. You just have to regulate it. But it's not that easy. When we think about regulation, we think about big companies or local governments that have a lot of capacity to just ask for certain requirements, and the transport providers will comply with those requirements. But in the case of popular transport, we have small and medium operators often owning a couple of vehicles and renting them out. And so it's very hard for them. They're also not subsidized. They're not supported by the government, and they're providing a service at cost. So any improvement we want them to make in terms of the quality of the service, of the operations, of optimizing the model, of improving the vehicles is very hard to do when they don't have that support. And also they face a lot of barriers in accessing finance. They have very high interest rates because usually the banks will not loan money to them. And so if we're thinking about a transition towards a decarbonized transport sector, we need to think about what type of mechanisms and what types of support we need to allocate to this sector so that they can actually not be left behind. So two of the key strategies that we've found successful in different places is fleet recapitalization strategies, and there's different ways to go about it. So we'll hear a bit about that, but also professionalization of the sector, engaging with the operators and figuring out, okay, how do you run your business? How can we support you to become a company, a transport company? How can we strengthen your operations and optimize them? So today we're going to hear about different experiences that address these elements, but also go beyond these two. So we'll learn a bit more about how to support, integrate, and just elevate the level of service of these transport providers. And we are going to start with Pawan, who's going to tell us a bit about WRI's experience in the sector, especially in India, telling us what has worked and what hasn't. And I'm going to step down and join them over there and we'll continue the conversation.
Thank you, Andrea, and warm welcome. Good morning, everyone. So when we're talking about this whole sector, there are 5 things to remember, right? One is there is vehicles that operate, whether it's 2-wheelers or 3-wheelers, dominantly 3-wheelers in the paratransit space or popular transport space. The other is drivers itself who are driving this. There is fares, which are in some geographies. Are we okay?
Okay, with Thor?
Yeah, okay. I hope we didn't panic. So there are vehicles, there are drivers, there is permit system. In certain geographies, there are permits which are some form of regulation by the local governments. In India, we do have permits at the state level, at the subnational level. Then you have fares, which are sometimes set by the state governments or subnational governments, and then you actually have the route choices, right? And then the overarching is the regulation and policy framework around this. Now, it's very important that we work at all 5 levels that we are talking about. And the vehicle driver is what you were talking about. The access to finance becomes a big challenge there, because given that many of them have to, in fact, we have looked data from city after city in India, almost anywhere between 70 to 80% of the folks, drivers actually borrow money from their family and friends. It's a very small percentage where they actually can go to a bank or what we call as NBFCs, which are like non-banking financial institutions, which actually would lend this money to these auto drivers. Poor credit history, all those challenges, but there are models that are coming up where they're saying that using telematics, ITS, can we actually track what's happening, and can we actually help drivers instead of doing month-long leases, so they actually have payment on a daily basis. So there is a change in the model that you're earning some X dollars and you're able to repay part of it on the same day. And then there is a credit history that you're able to build. So you actually have today, with the whole digitalization and the ability to track these vehicles and ability to even track the behavior of drivers to see how they are able to make this payment. So that's one. But one of the biggest innovation, I don't think anyone probably has heard in this room, which I wanted to talk, and you may want to search in Google later. It's called Namma Yatri, Namma, Namma, Yatri. Namma Yatri is an open platform that has been actually launched in Bengaluru, the city that I come from, the Silicon Valley of India, population of 15 million plus. What they have done is astonishing. So we used to have this Uber autos, informal, in the sense that individual driver-led autos. What they have tried to do is actually organize this sector by providing a platform for drivers. So it's not a platform which like Uber would actually be for Uber trying to, or, Ola, which is the most other auto platform. So they actually changed the whole perception. They said, let's actually make the drivers visible where they are, or their vehicle availability, right? So they're doing this 4-step process. And what they have done is they have standardized certain protocols for ability to find the vehicle, so you're saying that I need to be visible to my customers where they are wanting to see me. So that's one thing. Then they're talking about something called interoperability, that any platform can search me. I don't need to be only visible through one single platform, right? I can be visible through Uber, I can be visible through Ola, I can be visible through any other platform, and I am visible. So this is like the platform of the platforms where they're talking about that I'm available to you. So, and then the third step is they are facilitating this whole transaction happening, which is like I'm interoperability, I'm available, and then there is a fair integration. So India, you must all have heard about the UPI, right? The unified payment system, that where we can use now our phones or even static digital scanners to complete your transactions. So everyone, most of it's a big financial inclusion story that has happened, which would have otherwise taken 47 years, has been done in like less than 2-3 years. So you have this payment option digitally happening, and then there is service renders. So what this has actually done is that instead of, and there is zero commission to this, so the drivers are actually able to be visible on this platform. It has brought all these drivers together, and they are able to demonstrate their availability, whether it's electric or non-electric, doesn't matter. And it has kind of structured themselves to reorganize on how do they want to do this business. And then they have this single voice. They are doing right now almost 100,000 trips on a daily basis in just this city. And the beautiful part of this is this model is, it doesn't have commission. The standards and protocols for all the systems are publicly available. So if you and I as an entrepreneur want to go and launch this in any other cities, it is available for us to do it. So that's the beauty of the standards, open standards and protocols, what they call this. And now this is being seen, can we move this to taxis in Delhi? Can we really use for two-wheeler taxis in other cities? And also they're talking about taking this to Africa. So what I want to say is that innovation is still possible. And in the next one, I'll really talk about the financing angle that comes to how do you really look at actually bringing this sector together to really bring innovation and technology to transform this.
Thanks so much, Pawan. And I think it's really interesting to start off the conversation on the role of technology in this whole transition and how it's helping us in different ways to connect the drivers, to connect with the users, to actually generate credit scores. So we'll keep that on hold to have more discussion afterwards. And I'm now going to ask Fernanda if she can tell us a bit about the experience in Mexico. They're doing amazing things, not only in one type of vehicle, but in all different types of modes. So 5 minutes will be short for that, but tell us the wide perspective, and then we can afterwards ask more questions. Go ahead, Fernanda.
Thank you. I'm really happy to start discussing this paratransit and popular transportation. It represents the global south. Latin America and Asia, Africa, we have this type of mobility. I'm the General Director of Public Transport in Mexico City. I'm in charge of the taxis, the minibuses, the buses, the 2- and 3-wheelers, and all the regulations. I'm going to tell you about the microbuses. The microbuses are the private operated buses. They were given out in 1990. Some of them are older than me. They're more than 35 years old. So it's impressive that Mexico City can have all these contexts. It can have the transport as in London with these 2-floor BRTs. We can have cable cars, subway BRTs, but we also have this type of transport in the most poor places of the city. So inequalities are also part of the public transport debate or discussion. What we're doing in Mexico City, we have two different models where we recognize that they exist, that they move 7 million people every day in Mexico City, these type of buses, and that they need money, subsidy to change their units. They haven't done it not because they want to stay with these old microbuses. They haven't done it because they don't have the money to change these type of new operational scheme. It's really hard. I think that the easiest part is a technical one. The debate about what type of units, the study of demand, where you're going to put the stops, where is going to be the technical project. That is the easiest way. But when you start working with the public transport operators, you realize that the financial challenges, they're really hard because they have been in informality for almost 35 years. They don't have their concession regularized, their permit, it's not with the right information. A lot of people has died along these years and they never changed the title to the new owner. So we have to work along with them. Also, there's a lot of risk. The banks, they don't want to borrow any type of money. They give them really high interest rates. Some of them have never been part of the formal bank system, so they have never been registered in the national or public banks in Mexico City. And the third one is the social challenge. They don't trust the authorities. They don't believe in us. They're really skeptical about any type of projects. So whenever I have to sit in front of them and tell them like, yes, you can do it. You can trust in us. It's going to be a good project. They're like, no, it's been 30 years. A lot of people has been seated in your place and I don't believe you. So it takes us like 2 years to get their confidence, to get their trust in the projects, on the public officers like me. But it's amazing when you see that it's a reality. What we've done to surpass these challenges. The first one, we are giving them a bonus where we subsidy the new buses that they have to buy. We give a bonus for every old scrapped unit or old microbus that it's being scrapped of $27,000. So like we know that they are overflowed on the streets, this type of buses. For every 3 old units, they need to buy a new one. So we are covering more or less 70% of the total cost of the new buses that they have to buy. This helps us because we reduce the debt that they're going to have in the future. Secondly, they have to integrate the payment with the transport card. This is Mexico City integrated mobility card that works for BRTs, cable cars, but also for the new transport companies. This is useful in the banks because it works as a funding. They can get the money because all this money gets to the city and then gets paid for the operators. And we also have another model where we use trolley buses. They electrified and they changed to a trolley buses model, but in this case, the city pays the operation. So we subsidize the whole process of buying the new buses, well, the trolley buses, because they're more expensive than this type of bus, but we also cover the operational with the payment for every kilometers that is, operated by these type of buses. And the third part that it's what I love the most, we work with the public transport owners and we give them a lot of information. What is a bank? How do you register in the financing system? And we work with our national bank, is Nacional Financiera. And as the government, Mexico City, we give a warranty so that they can get this funding from the National Financiera Bank with a lower interest rate. So we act as, well, a godfather of the public transport man, so they don't have to pay these high interest rates. It's really interesting because you can imagine that Mexico City, everything is sold, but we have 16,000 private owned buses that are operated in this model. So that's a big challenge. We're working actually with C40, we're working with different organizations to put this on the plate and that we understand that this is social justice. These are the guys that have been operating for 35 years, that in the city move 7 million people on a daily basis. So we trust that we should focus on this popular transport. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Fernanda. And I think what you just mentioned is essential. This is social justice. At the end of the day, the popular transport operators are the ones that are covering the gaps that the government itself has not been able to fill for years as well in a lot of places. So it's essential that we recognize that as a first step, that they are assets to our cities that are solving mobility and accessibility gaps, and that if we take it away, people will be without any options to move around. So now we're going to move to a little something a little bit more different, focusing on the technical part. And in all the conversations we've been hearing these days, electrification is something that's very big in the transport sector. But the conversation usually goes around buses and big public transport buses. But in popular transport, usually the scale is not that big. And in South Africa, we see that the most popular way of moving around is minibus taxis. And so Tinos is going to talk to us about how are they going about electrifying this mode of transportation, and what are the challenges and opportunities you found in this process? Go ahead, Tinos.
Thank you, Andrea. Yes, I'm from South Africa, and I think one of the biggest learnings for me in this conference is that context really matters. It's important that we don't think the global South is one entity, and we don't even think that one continent is one entity. Within Africa, each country has its own unique challenges. So I need to quickly just explain some of the context of South Africa to you. In South Africa, we have a very productive and big vehicle production entity, or at least a few entities that produce vehicles, and these vehicle production facilities are responsible for approximately 2% of employment in the country. Now, with a country where unemployment is approximately 34%, that is substantial. More than this, indirectly or directly, this vehicle production is responsible for almost 4% of our GDP. All right, so it's really big. The consequence of that is there are a lot of import duties. You can't, for example, import secondhand vehicles into South Africa. And then if you wanted to bring in a vehicle, you are punished with taxes. You want to probably sell a vehicle inside the country that's made in the country. But more than this, you're actually penalized if you move over into an electric vehicle. So if you import an electric vehicle, you're not incentivized. You pay extra tax for it. It's seen as a luxury item. Now, in that context, just consider what has been said so far. The predominant mode of transport in South Africa is actually with minibus taxis. It's slightly smaller than the Mexico City taxis. It's typically 16-seater vehicles. And we have 250,000 of these in South Africa. And 70% of trips in sub-Saharan Africa, not just South Africa, are completed with these, what we call minibus taxis. Now, in that context, none of the vehicles that are produced in South Africa are electrical today. Nothing. You can't buy an electric vehicle that's made in the country, even though we produce a lot. And the majority of the vehicles that are produced are exported to Europe. So in a very short space of time, in the next 10 years or so, that production facility is going to run into an issue because we're not going to be able to export those vehicles, which means we're in a catch-22. We have to convert to electric. But on the flip side, and that's where the context is important again, we don't have enough electricity in sub-Saharan Africa to even carry the current load, never mind electric vehicles. So from our perspective, which is quite different to the other perspective, South American and Indian perspectives that have been presented, we can't talk about electric vehicles without talking about the electricity infrastructure and without talking about electricity generation. So from our perspective, it's really electric mobility rather than electric vehicles. Okay, now take a step back. Often people would say there's this, because our electricity is generated with coal, there's a big debate of whether it's even cleaner to go over onto electric vehicles, right? But at least you're moving the emissions, you're moving the pollutants out of the city. But the one thing that nobody can argue with is that if you take an existing vehicle and you retrofit it to an electric version, then the footprint is substantially less than having to produce a whole new minibus taxi and import it at an exorbitant fee, or also just to stay on petrol or diesel vehicles. So what we've been doing is we've been retrofitting a minibus taxi in South Africa. And just to contextualize the prices, more or less, it's approximately $25,000 to buy a petrol or diesel vehicle. It's approximately 3 times as much to buy an electric vehicle, mostly because of the import duties and because it's not locally produced. Now, what we did is to retrofit, but with a specific purpose to build skills and to act as a stepping stone towards electrification and to plan for electrification. So in building those skills, we're basically setting up the transition, and the cost of making this electrified vehicle is substantially less than having to import the vehicle. Some of the pictures that you'll see on the show there is, first of all, the minibus taxi, but we've also done a bus. And in terms of the minibus taxi, just to give you an idea of the savings, the buses that are operating, there are 2 buses operating in Cape Town. The savings are in the region of 60% or so. But if you were to convert an electric taxi, as we've done now, the savings are closer to 80%, just because of the way these things move. They continuously operate, and in the middle of the day, when they need to charge, they can probably charge from solar infrastructure as well. So it's not a bad deal to have them running. What we found is typically the efficiency of this retrofit actually outperforms some of the new electric vehicles that we've seen, even though they're not available in the country. And as you can see there, the operating cost is slightly more than the new vehicle. And there are many risks that you need to consider. I'll tell you what they are in a second. So some of the risks, for example, is if you're working with an old vehicle, you need to be very clear about the state of the condition of that vehicle. It needs to be in such a state that you can trust whatever was built in, because if something fails, the liability falls on the entity that converted the vehicle. That's one of the risks. Another risk is the homologation, or getting the vehicle roadworthy. That has been a substantial challenge, but we've managed to figure out how to do that. And then the other big issue is scalability. Fortunately, the predominant vehicle in the country is a high-ace hybrid or a high-ace type vehicle. It's a Toyota. The majority of vehicles in the country look exactly the same. And also the buses that we are retrofitting, the company that owns them have 1,100 of them. So it's not a matter of having to adjust the retrofit procedure. It's a copy and paste, rinse and repeat. Just looking at the slide popping up now, what the retrofit basically entailed was ripping out the engine, ripping up the fuel tank, ripping out the gearbox, and then replacing it with an electric motor, control electronics, a battery, and a display cluster. That's basically what we've done. And this thing has been running, I think we've done just under 1,000 kilometers in the last month or so. I'll be lying if I told you it was easy, and it's been a real headache to get it off and running. But now that it's running, it's actually quite efficient, and I think something that's worth considering. Final comment is just the investment part of this. If you buy a new electric vehicle, minibus taxi like this one, and import it, the payment, or at least it makes financial sense after 7 years. After 7 years, it breaks even with a current diesel or petrol vehicle. If you use the retrofit, it takes 1 year to do so. So it's a difference is 30,000 kilometers versus 220,000 kilometers before you break even with petrol, diesel. So I think there's a substantial benefit to at least investigating this, and then possibly even doing it as a step towards electrification. Thanks very much, Andrea.
Thanks so much. I think one of the things that I would rescue from all this information you've given us is that actually the solutions have to be context specific. It really is very different. The regulation, the type of the city, the type of vehicles we're using in each city in different places around the global south, and even in the global north, because we have popular transport in some places in the global north as well. The conditions are completely different. So we can't really copy paste solutions. So that's also why we're trying to represent different ways in which this is happening in different places. So thanks so much for giving us also the South African context, which is essential to understand why what you're doing is important. And last but not least, one of the key things that we've started talking about, but that we need to expand on more, and which is the topic of the conference, is how do we fund this? And what are the experiences supporting different countries in doing this transition and engaging with the sector and trying to invest in improving the sector? So, Lenaik, can you tell us the experience of the European Commission? And also, we know you've worked in several countries doing projects engaging with popular transport. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you for having me this morning. I'd like to start saying that for European Commission, urban mobility has become a very important topic in our transport portfolio. It's not been the case historically. Although in Europe, if you look at the European landscape, we have development agencies like GIZ or EU finance institutions, the French Development Agency, European Investment Bank, that have worked in urban mobility for quite some time. For us, it's been a relatively recent development, and that is a consequence of the recognition of very fast-growing cities around the world, in particular in Africa, with a number of problems associated to that development. Congestion, loss of economic activity and growth, pollution with health problems. And we've recognized this issue. Investing in urban mobility has been also very much in line with our climate agenda. And it's become quite important to look at this particular subsector of the transport portfolio. And the third point on that topic, you may have heard of our new political offer regarding investment in the Global South, Global Gateway, and transport is one pillar of Global Gateway, one very important pillar. And with Global Gateway, we've really opened the scope of our intervention in the transport sector over the last few years. Traditionally, we've done a lot of land infrastructure, road infrastructure in Africa. We've really opened to all the modes of transport from maritime sector, rail and other modes of transport, including urban mobility, with a very high priority on trying to decarbonize the transport sector. So what do we do, European Commission? First, essential to say that we are a grant provider. We don't provide debt, for instance, either for private sector or for the public sector, sovereign sector. But and that's another very important development on our side. Historically, we were funding projects on our own, so to say. Now we're very much looking at teaming up with other finance institution partners, in particular European, but not only. World Bank or African Development Bank could be other partners, to put together financial package that will blend, mix grant with debt. Mostly public and sovereign debt, but in some cases we can also do with the private finance debt. We have a particular case in Dakar. I will mention it a bit later. So very important for us to put our grant and subsidy money where it makes sense. And if we look at the projects we have in urban mobility, it's for instance to support all the Paratransit peri-urban side of things. So a bit aside the backbone infrastructure that have been mentioned in these days, the metro lines, the BRTs, that is very much the most bankable components of transport investment. So we leave it very much to the finance institutions, to the banks. But when it comes to the other parts of the transport system in a given city, there are less bankable aspects, and then that's where we step in with our grant. Grant also very much useful when you try to leapfrog and to get into cleaner modes of transport and move out for the traditional, even most recent and cleaner fossil fuel solutions. When you move to electric mobility or the cleaner mode of transport, there's a premium you have to pay on the capex. It's been mentioned, so we can step in with subsidy and grant to cover this premium that otherwise could pose problem in terms of bankability and financial efficiency of the economic efficiency of the investments. Important for us also to strengthen as much as we can everything that is linked to climate adaptation when it's about building infrastructure or supplying rolling stock. It's very important in cities. We know that cities are very much exposed to extreme climate events, including the transport system. So if there is again a premium regarding infrastructure, we can step in with a subsidy to cover this less bankable aspect. And maybe I should have mentioned that at first. The grant money is also used for all the policy work, the project preparation, the capacity building. So those components again of investment that are less attractive for the finance institution, for the banks, and we come in, we blend our grant, and you have a comprehensive financial package to cover all aspects of projects and investment. What have you, in terms of portfolio, what have you seen in the last years or the few years we've been increasing our presence? First, big cities obviously attract a lot of the investment and the projects, in particular, again, the backbones. And we're now moving towards the peri-urban areas to have comprehensive packages and to really try to cover especially the most vulnerable people that live a bit outside of the main city centers. So we're having now more holistic projects really covering large urban areas and not only the centers and the backbones regarding the transport system. What we're seeing as well is that aside the big capitals, smaller capital cities are coming in with interests and needs regarding improving their transport system. And we're very much interested with these cities because they're not facing the huge issues that big cities are facing. So we can anticipate a bit the planning and address issues that may arise in the near future. It's not too late in some big cities, in particular in Africa. The situation is really problematic. In smaller capitals, you still have time to properly plan and intervene. And now we're also seeing secondary cities in big countries coming in with a lot of interest to also plan as from now, anticipate, and then build infrastructure and start moving towards more sustainable systems. I can elaborate a bit more later on Dakar because I took probably most of my time.
But just in time, I was just about to cut you off. So well done. So I have a lot of questions to ask all of you, but we have a good crowd, and I'm glad that everyone found their way eventually. So I just wanted to open up the floor. Let me know if there's any questions in the chat as well. I have 2 questions here, and then maybe 3 questions, and then we can go to the chat over there first, if you want. Maybe can you give him a mic?
Yeah, I guess I can shout.
We have an online audience, so maybe, just so they hear you.
Well, thank you very much for the excellent panel. I guess sometimes we spend a lot of time thinking about great and huge infrastructure projects that mature in 20 years, which they are okay, but we do not pay enough attention to these sort of issues that, affect everyday life. So I have 2 questions, if I may, one very specific and a generic one. The specific goes to Fernanda. I understand, well, first things first, and the fleet renewal, it's really important. But the question is, what happens afterwards? I guess OPEX really, all the operational cost becomes much more significant than before in terms of taxes that formalized operators have to pay. Mechanics, they cannot handle on their own. They have to go somewhere in order to ensure guarantees and everything. How does integrated fares? There are such more costs than they have to face. And how does the state work on that? And if there is a danger that maybe they are eventually taken over by big operators, which I guess it's not the previous objective. And the second one, a generic one, a couple of years back, I was working in northern Peru, in Chiclayo, in which public transport is mainly operated by informal taxis and informal minibuses. So the first question I made to the authorities was how much, what is the daily ridership in the city? Because I guess the problem was very different if it was 50,000 or 200, and they didn't know. And it wasn't that they didn't care, they didn't have the tools or the incentives because the system quite kind of operated itself. And I understand, there are lots of positive externalities on actually regulating, but how can we face the regulator in order to, many of the recipes that you've told us, they are in work, they are in design, and they might be, ready to be used. How can we handle or work with the regulators, which they don't see it as a problem, for us not to be like the international bureaucrats that aim to teach them how to work? Thank you.
So go ahead, Fernanda, and then we'll open the floor to the rest.
That's the most important question because it's the afterwards. Like I told you, the technical part is the easiest one. No, when you're deciding where to put them. The 2 big challenges that they have is the first one, that it's more expensive to have these bus companies because they have to pay taxes, they have to give social security to the operators, and they change completely from the operate. And the second one is the cash flow. They're usually they're used to get the money on a daily basis, and now they're going to get the money on a monthly basis, on a weekly basis, or something quite different. What we have made different during this term is that we have a specific area in CEMOVI, in the Ministry of Mobility, that makes all the financial analysis. So we can give them the security that they're going to be sustainably financing for that next 10 years. So hopefully they are going to operate in the best way. They will change the way they get their income. But what I can see, being critical to my work, is that when we start with these new buses, they continue operating in the same way. That's the hardest part because they usually do not prepare the frequencies. They don't do the stops on demand instead of in the bus stops that we're trying to put. So we have to change their mindset. So I think that's the next big challenge that Mexico City is going to have. We have a specific area in the Ministry of Mobility that is the Transport Regulation Organism, that when we converted them from these public routes, they get regulated by this new organism. And I think that we need to focus on how we can give them more for more regulations or more importance so they can regulate better. Another model that is quite different, is really new in Mexico City, is the trolley buses. This is interesting because we give them a 15 years title so they can operate, and they get paid by kilometer that they operating in the whole route. This is a new model that we're just trying out. It just started 2 years ago. We scrapped 224 old microbuses for 14 trolley buses. So they have to change 16 units for a new one. And now they are trying to understand how they're going to get paid. So we're still analyzing how to surpass these challenges. But that's the biggest question.
Thank you. And on the question on how to engage with the regulators themselves, does anyone have any insights they'd like to share? Go ahead.
I can say here indeed it's very important, and it's not only the regulators, it's all the ecosystem regarding urban mobility. So you have the central governments, ministries of finance, transport, you have the municipalities, you have the regulators, of course the operators. I may have forgot some, and it's extremely important to engage with all these people, to have a lot of consultation and to have a holistic approach when you plan the mobility system, when you prepare investments. Essential. And for us, from the Commission, we've been supporting programs that exactly do this work. Of course, I should mention that in Africa, the Africa Transport Policy Program, SSATP, they have one pillar out of 4 on urban mobility, and they've done for years a huge of work into structuring this ecosystem, supporting the regulators that in Africa, some are now becoming important, some are just emerging and it needs a lot of accompaniment, but there is a lot of willingness to structure the systems in the cities. We are supporting now and renewing our support to Mobilize Your City, a big program which is implemented by GIZ, the German GIZ and the French Development Agency, and that's also into planning, transport, preparing the sustainable urban management plan, the SAMs that have been mentioned by the Belgian colleague yesterday. So we are supporting that to make sure that all the paving the way into investment, the preparation, all the regulatory framework is conducive to investment and improvement of the system, including the greening and the decarbonization part of it. And by doing so also the fleet renewal and recapitalization, because it's the topic of the session. So it's all ecosystem you need to accompany, and that's where I think our grant money is quite important to do so. And but we're very much aware of that, and it's very important, of course.
Just because we have little time and more questions, I would just add that this type of activities is something that for us is essential to start building capacities, not only talking about the operators and the drivers and the sector, but also the regulators and the authorities need to shift their mindset on this is a problem to this is something that's solving things on the ground, and maybe I need to approach it. And how should I approach it? How do I engage with the operator? So now that you mentioned Mobilize Your City has a very good toolkit regarding how to actually address the sector and start with step-by-step, different steps from engaging with the operators to drafting the regulations and what are we going to ask them or how to support them with funding, etc. And so there are new initiatives that are actually also supporting the regulators and authorities, communities of practice that are being built. We need to work definitely on both sides. So that's definitely essential. I'll take Carlos's question.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, just a short comment on Pawan to tell Namayatri thank you for actually publishing the code and for actually using everything open, because every conference I go to, when somebody says it's open source, it's not really true, but as you were saying, it is true, it is here. I have a very specific technical question about how the standard relates to other standards, but I think that's better for after, because we may get into the weeds and never stop. But then to Fernanda, I wanted to ask, you said that for every new vehicle, you expect the operator to find 3 old vehicles and then you pay them. I wanted to know, and maybe you will talk frustratingly about how difficult it is to get the money for that, and whether you're thinking about any sources or new sources to cover that.
I'm happy to say that it's not that hard in Mexico City, because we have a public fund that it's specifically designed for the transport transformation. It's called FIFINTRA, that is the financial funding for public transport, where we get this public money so we can give these bonuses. What is hard for some of them, is to get everything regularized. The papers, the old microbus, because we ask them to have everything in order so we can scrap them and we can pay the money. The money never goes to the operators. We pay directly to the bus vendors. So until now, it's nice to say that we haven't lacked of money in the FIFINTRA. So it's easy for Mexico City to have this program. It's the priority. This is the oldest transport, and it has expired titles since 1990. So we have to focus on how we invest in here. And something interesting that you ask is we saw on other projects from last terms that there was a monopolization of one guy getting a lot of companies. Now we're working with the local leaders. So this is also really interesting because they're learning, they're behind in this story. So we have to get more trust, and it takes us more time to make the projects because we work with the newbies, with the ones that have been operating for 40 years, but they have never converted into a bus company, because the easiest one is to work with the one that already has experience. But when you work with the ones with no experience, it takes more time for the authorities to work with them, but it's better, I think.
Thanks so much. We have more questions than time, unfortunately. I'm actually going to give maybe space for, is there no online questions? Okay, then you're very lucky because then we have time for one more question.
Thank you. Thanks for the great discussion. My name's Sam Johnson. I work at the World Bank. I'm leading a work called Reducing Car Dependency for Greener and Healthier Cities, and working with 12 countries in the Pacific Islands on that. So the focus of that program is really about reducing vehicle ownership and use. And I'm interested to get your views of what beyond the obvious, but what contribution that popular transit and what novel ways we can make popular transit contributing to that goal of reducing personal car ownership and use.
I'll talk a very India-specific context. Think what we call this auto systems, right? The three-wheelers really actually do this kind of services, and they're individual operators. Actually, these are not companies. And I don't think the intent is to convert them into companies. So that's the difference we're talking about in India. And almost, I would say, in urban areas, majority of this tier 1 cities, these do anywhere between 8 to 12% of the trips, right, in terms of all this popular transport. And huge opportunity in terms of how they're replacing, right? Basically, you're talking about your home-based shopping, your home-based your non-home-based trips, which actually can be served by this. And if you really combine that with shared mobility concept, because that's quite popular in many of the cities like Mumbai, where people are actually willing to share this with 3-seaters, and some of them in Delhi with 5-seaters, is can you actually then enable through as last mile connectivity to public transport is big opportunity. Connecting to public transportation for employee transportation, where we are trying to actually test a pilot of behavioral nudge. What will it really take to incentivize employee transportation to use this popular transport as last mile combined with your public transportation, right? Because that's the big gap that we have to address, that you have this trunk systems in many of the cities, but you don't have the last mile availability. And how do you then use popular transport to really do that? So from a decarbonization perspective, it's very clear. I don't think any of the Indian cities will function if we didn't have this popular transport, because a lot of the trips that we actually don't account for happens through this. And in rural areas, their benefit is even more, because they're talking about taking their agriculture produce. It's also about taking people for healthcare, for education. So it's quite well established fact. Now, I just had 2 other points to make. In terms of regulation itself, how much is the level of regulation that we actually need for this, right? It's also a balance. And it was wanting to respond from earlier point. What is it that we want to regulate? Basically, in India, what we're trying to do is what is the number of vehicles can this be deployed? Because you want to ensure that the drivers are able to earn enough. So we have this 1/3 rule, right? Typically, most of them are leasing these vehicles from some owners. So 1/3 of your cost that you earn is to pay back this lease on a daily basis. 1/3 is probably for your fuel and maintenance and all that, and 1/3 is what you take home. So the question is, how do you put more money to these drivers as entrepreneurs? How do you bring pride in having this? Because this is like, you're running this for like almost 12 to 14 hours. You have to really search for customers. So there are these challenges that we need to see. Can digitization and electrification address these challenges? If we don't look from this as a pure decarbonization problem, I don't think we are going to be able to solve it. We really need to look at it from, are we able to give more money to drivers? What is the role of regulation? The right amount of regulation. You don't want to regulate so much that you're actually killing the innovation. So I feel that there is a strong push now with digitization, better telematics, have their searchability, that they are available actually, have them combined with bus systems, with metro systems for employee transportation. You actually create and organize them in that way. I feel that would be a win-win. So even when we're talking about electrification for us in India, very specifically to this system, the big question is, your e-rickshaws, which is the 5-seater low speeds, are lead acid based, right? And your e-autos, many of the subnational government have talked about retrofits. They are giving incentives to really do this, but the transition is going to be very, very difficult, because you need to address the issue of upfront capital cost. You need to address the issue of financing, and the big question is, at the end of the day, what is it doing to the drivers? Why would they really actually transition? Because it doesn't have. Why is it the vulnerable population should be pushed to decarbonize when everyone else is actually driving cars? So unless we as think tanks, policymakers address these questions of what is the problem we are trying to solve for drivers, it's better driving conditions, better takeaway income. I think we need to focus on those. And how do you then bring women entrepreneurs or women drivers to also be part of this? I think then you're able to solve. I don't think it can be solved as a pure decarbonization.
I'm told we have time for one more question. And we have had all men asking, so I'm going to give it to her. Go ahead.
Thanks. So Marisela from GRSF, the Global Road Safety Facility within the bank. And I just wanted to ask a bit more on details on the safety part, on all this regulation, and also, in this training or of the drivers, maximum driving hours, you were saying of all this 10 to 12 hours, when we know that, they should be regulated to a maximum of spans, as to really make the driver not being, avoiding fatigue and other aspects. So on the regulatory part, what are you doing on the safety aspects, not only in driving hours, but even like standards for the vehicle safety? And also, this last mile that you were mentioning as well, what are we doing on the actual motorbike being used, as boraboras and so forth? So just, I could, talk for hours, but what would be this kind of main priorities in terms of safety that you're doing on these things? Thanks.
So I'll be very specific to two-wheelers and three-wheelers. I think we have a very good standards around homologations, where you need to actually standardize the vehicles, right? You can't just produce, but I do understand in Africa the situation is quite different because it's an assembling market there. But in the smaller segments, low speed segment, we actually have anyone and everyone manufacturing. So there needs to be a lot of regulation to be brought in to ensure that the components and the vehicles are quite standard. There also the issues with fire safeties and all that with the new batteries. The speed is quite tricky in the two-wheeler segment, and that's one I don't think we actually have addressed that. But fortunately, in our bigger cities, we are traveling at speeds of 10 kilometers per hour. So probably the two-wheelers are not, but I would still say, given the data that we have looked at, most of the crashes are between pedestrians, and two-wheelers are anywhere between 30 to 40% causing this stuff. And there's a lot to do in terms of safety. I don't think this is being addressed as part of regulation at all right now. But given that many of these delivery, it's actually what we're seeing is a lot of these crashes, at least from the initial understanding, is happening because of this promise by delivery companies because we have a huge delivery market in India, and they are talking about 10-minute guarantee, 20-minute guarantee. I don't think we really want to get into that without looking at safety. And there is a huge role for regulation to really play that. So I don't think we have done anything, honestly, in terms of regulation. And on your second question related to fatigue itself, I don't think these are continuous hours that drivers are driving for two-wheelers and three-wheelers. They actually have gaps because it also depends upon how your city is moving, right? So you have peaks and off peaks. So it's not like a bus system in Mexico where they really have to drive continuously. You're like taking, in fact, a lot of the drivers actually take naps because in the afternoons they have this 2-3 hours window where they're not able to find rides, right? And they want to slow down. So from that aspect, I don't think we have seen a challenge, but two-wheelers is a huge challenge in terms of safety.
In the case of buses, the idea is to change the operational scheme. So instead of driving 16 hours long that they usually ride all this time, they should ride 8 hours. But what's happening, I think that it's something that's going to be shared in many cities, is that a lot of drivers, they don't want to get into these new formal type of contracts. They prefer the informality. So we're having a lack of bus drivers in Mexico City, even for the public-owned bus companies in the city. So that's a discussion that we should have, that there are a lot of bus drivers that they don't want the social security, they don't care about having a salary, they just prefer to have the money on a daily basis, even though they have to drive for 16 hours long. So that's another panel that we should have about this formal, informal lack of drivers that we're having in our cities.
Yeah, very briefly, road safety is very much part of what we're trying to do with Paratransit. It's another pillar of SSATP, as a matter of fact. So very proud of supporting that. If I look at Dakar, the example I know a bit better. So we'll be supporting the cooperatives, the informal small entities that are operating the paratransit buses. It will be very much part of the professionalization, formalization of the activity, and you have to provide incentives for those people, companies to get into the formal sector. There'll be a few million euros put into TVET, training those people, having contracts, decent pay. So really raising the level of quality of work, quality of life of those people. And if you have these incentives for them to see that if they get into the formal and professional activity, they will be get in return a lot of advantages for their quality of work of life. So it's about finding those incentives that will trigger ultimately the safety. And of course, we will also support the renewal. Well, it's not really renewal, because it's really expansion of the fleet, because we found out that it's not that we will renew the fleet, because there is such a demand that the additional buses, clean buses we will bring, will just cover the additional demand, because the demand is growing extremely fast. So, but anyway, it's the expansion of the fleet with clean technologies that will be so important on the technology side for safety. But it's a vast subject in the urban system and mobility in general.
Just before you run off to lunch, just want to quickly say it's very important about what was said here earlier about how to approach the drivers and the owners. But it's important to acknowledge that, at least in our context, we have drivers, we have owners, and we have associations. And the drivers are basically just employees. They don't really have a say. The people who have a say are the owners, and the owners are associated with associations. So what the World Bank at the TTL in South Africa is trying very hard to do is to formalize at the association levels to get buy-in from the owners, and then the drivers will just have to fall in place. And that'll address the issue of safety and professionalization, fatigue and everything. I think that's the way to go.
Thank you so much. As you see, this topic often gives us more questions than answers, but that's why it's important to continue having these conversations and continue engaging and learning from each other, because all of the different cases throw out so much knowledge and so much interesting insights that we can use to continue learning and implementing better practices around the world. With this, I will give it forward to Ibu Diouf, from the World Bank Transport Practice Manager. He's a World Bank Practice Manager for West and Central Africa, who will give us some closing remarks. And I will invite our panelists to sit in the front so that Ibu can close off the session. Thank you very much.
There's no need to expect that I will be making closing remarks. I just want to kind of summarize what we heard so far and what are the takeaways that we can actually run with. Let me first of all thank also Simon and team for putting together this session. I know it has been very tense and in a very short term, you've been able to put this session. We're a bit afraid that we won't have enough people when we started. This is a room that is very difficult to find, including for World Bank staff. Myself and Mustafa, we got lost and we have to get help to find the place. No, thank you very much. I think, the way you structured this panel is really impressive because we have had, I would say, a great spectrum of what is happening in this arena. I think, Fernanda, you mentioned it earlier, in each of our in big cities in developing countries, the bulk of the demand is moved by this, what you call popular transport. I will buy your term for now. We were talking about informal, paratransit, whatever. Now I will call it popular transport system. Actually, and this is really what is happening everywhere, no matter the continent we are talking about. And they have some challenges associated with. I think the panelists have discussed this at length in terms of safety, in terms of pollution, and the impact on the cost, of course, for end users. What I have really wanted to consider as takeaways from what we heard so far, we heard different perspectives. First, a city at the local government level with Mexico City. We've seen the example that is being actually tested because I heard Mrs. Let me find your name again.
Fernanda, she's Andrea.
Andrea, sorry. Mrs. Fernanda is, you mentioned many times, if I recall very well, that this is actually a learning process. You just started 2 years ago. And, as we go, you will be, of course, taking lessons from what. But I like the fact that you mentioned two things, that this is for social justice, because they are the ones that are really actually fulfilling a public mandate in moving people around and making the city vibrant and social connections, access to opportunities, everything. And this is something that we need to follow closely. And I would like to kindly ask you if you would share with the organizers the website where people can find information on what is happening in Mexico. We also had this excellent example of South Africa. I think the fact that you have a mechanism to retrofit the current fleet towards e-vehicles is also something that I think many countries could learn from, in particular the developing countries and focus in Africa. European Commission also shared the perspective of a donor or development partner. And I think what I take from what you mentioned, Lenaik, is that you are actually using different instruments, but also different products to support the social dimension, and I would say the non-monetarized aspect of the reforms that are needed, in particular policies, institutional and capacity building, but also this blending, I would say, mechanism that you are putting together to make finance more accessible and less costly for operators. I think I have also noticed a great example of India. What can technology do to help us actually modernize the system, make it more efficient, and actually giving, I would say, ownership to the operators and putting them on the front line to actually collaborate and have a kind of collaborative platform with an open source mechanism. So in conclusion, I would say that, fleet recapitalization program should not be seen only as renewal mechanism just to replace vehicles. I think it should be put into a bigger strategy for urban mobility in cities, and should include all aspects related to professionalization, modernization of the system, but keeping in mind one thing, and I think that our colleague from India mentioned it twice. First, we need to know what do we need to modernize or to reform or to address before we take one step further. Because if we don't do that, we run the risk of disrupting the system. The low equilibrium that we have there, it makes it cost affordable. If we are not careful enough in trying to reform the system and modernize it, we can disrupt the system and get it to failure. So let me just highlight what I see as benefits for doing this. Using the fleet renewal as a unique kind of opportunity to introduce regulatory reform that would make the system more efficient and more productive. Second, use the mechanism as well to improve the energy sources, like moving toward electric. I heard the word that if you couple digital and electric vehicles, we've seen the example in the case of South Africa, where from 300 something in terms of OPEX, you're down to less than 100, which is really significant. And I think we need to also keep this in mind as something that we could. We heard about safety, and it should be at the core of the system. Usually for transport systems, we talk usually about quality benefits, but the central aspect that should be put in the middle should be related to safety first. And I think you made a good point in reminding us that whatever we do, we need to have this safety aspect in mind. It's good for our environment. We have seen it also. If I think one of the things that in transport economics we haven't been very good enough so far is to internalize the health aspect, in particular linked to air pollution in our economic analysis. To also, as we talked about leapfrogging digital, I think we need in the transport community to talk about leapfrogging professionalization of our paratransit system. We have now a great momentum in terms of digital availability, AI availability. We also have a great momentum in terms of energy mix to make it happen. And I think we need to embrace this. And finally, to conclude, let me just ask all of us to build on success stories and learn from each other and move forward in transforming transportation as a platform to transform the paratransit sector and system. Thank you very much.